Hello and welcome to this screencast on global sporting events, and we're going to be concentrating on the second part. So today we're going to be going through the positive and negative impacts on the host country city of hosting global sporting events. The main kind of sporting events we need to get into our head because they're participated in by the majority of the world. Comparison to other events are the Olympic Games and the World Cup. So we need to be focusing on this part here. So we're going to be looking at positives and negatives, sporting impact, social, economical and political, as we've got here. So first one, we've got positive and negative impacts of hosting global sporting events on sport. So in terms of positives, first of all, we need to be aware there's going to be an increased profile of sports involved, e.g. cycling, which is going to increase the participation and also increase performance. If we think back to the 2012 London Olympics, there are definitely now more people participating in cycling that were before the London 2012 Games, because the profile of the game just increased dramatically due to the success of the Team GB within those games. We also need to be aware as well, it raises profile of minority sports as well. If we look back to the Paralympics in 2012, we now have more disabled participants taking part in wheelchair rugby, for example. Okay, so what these global sporting events are really good at are, first of all, increasing the profile of sports involved, as well as raising the profile of minority sports, such as wheelchair rugby, for example. Another positive is increases organisation of sport, e.g. national governing bodies and sports science, i.e. we get more funding, more money into sports science, therefore we get better developments and we get an increase in hopefully performance from that as well. If we look at increased funding for sport, so we need to think back to if we think back to 2015 Rugby World Cup, rugby received an increase in lottery funding. Therefore, we had new facilities built, which meant that we're going to get better quality facilities, obviously, and then that would increase the profile of sport, more people want to play the sport, and so on. We also get commercial sponsorship in terms of, if you think of the world and the Euros right now, for example, Coca-Cola is a sponsor, therefore money goes into the sport from their sponsorship. And then finally, increased development of world-class facilities. So if we look back to London 2012, the facility I think of is the Velodrome straight away that was built. Okay, also got the Olympic Stadium that was built in London as well. So we get an increase in this development of world-class facilities at when it comes to global sporting events. So it has a really positive impact on sport in general. However, following positive impacts, we're also going to get negative impacts as well from this. So non-Olympic minority sports reduce profile further. So these are going to be in a bit of an order. So if you look, we've got increased profile of sports involved, e.g. cycling. However, those sports that are not involved, the minority sports that are not involved, they're going to have an even less or reduced profile even more. So, okay, so if you're thinking about squash, for example, squash is not an Olympic sport, therefore, during that time period, funding decreases for squash, less people are playing squash, and so on, and it's a vicious circle in that sense. We also have increased chance of deviance, performance-enhancing drugs. This one links to an increase in sports science. So we get an increased organisation of sport, which is a really good positive. So we get increased developments in sports science. However, this means we also get an increased risk or chance of deviance within sport and people or performers taking performance-enhancing drugs. So there's some negatives that come along with an increased organisation of sport. And then finally, funding can be withdrawn from sports with low medal winning potential. So yes, you get an increase in funding for sports. However, there is also, or there can be funding withdrawn from sports that do not do so well. Basketball, we do not do well at basketball in the Olympics as a nation. Therefore, basketball as a whole around the country gets less funding, therefore less facilities, therefore less people participating, therefore less coaches available, and so forth. I've given you the example as well with regards to the Rio Olympic Games, because the male hockey team went out in the group stage if the female team did not win the Olympics that year, hockey would have lost a lot of funding. Therefore, people would have had to, these performers wouldn't have been able to play hockey for a job. Therefore, they'd have to go and get another job. Therefore, their participation in the sport of hockey might have reduced, and so forth in that sense as well. So funding can be withdrawn from sports that do not medal well if we're thinking about the Olympics. So that is positive and negative impacts of hosting global sporting events on sport, as well as wasted facilities after the global event. This is quite a big issue, okay? If we look back to the Barcelona Olympics, they have a stadium that is built there that doesn't get used anymore. We also look back to the birdcage in the Beijing Olympics, that hardly gets used anymore. So you've got these fantastic facilities that are built, however, due to the cost of these facilities, other sports can't take on the pressures of paying for these facilities. Therefore, these facilities just get wasted and no one uses them. So if we look at positive and negative impacts of hosting global sporting events on society, we have got increased participation in an active lifestyle due to community use of facilities. So the facilities that are left behind by the Olympics can be used by local communities. Okay, so society, we are thinking now as a community where we live, the people we interact with. So it's good in sense of facilities being used to increase participation. Accommodation from the events can be used for housing. So for example, the London 2012 Olympic Village is now being used for housing in London. So the village is where the athletes stay when the Olympic Games is on. After that, these flats are then converted into housing for the people of London. Nation building, okay, so in terms of on society, these sporting events can increase pride and patriotism of a whole nation. I remember London 2012, I remember the country being a really happy place at that time of year. We were doing well, we were successful, there was a national pride about us, and it was a really good, uplifting environment to be part of. And then also, it's really good on society, there's an increase in transport links. So for example, for the London 2012 Games, there was actually a train line built specifically for that, which was called the Javelin train line, and now that is being used just a part of everyday life. So negatives, if we try and go side by side again, we get unfair benefits linked to host cities. So for example, when England hosted the Olympics, I keep calling it London 2012, everything was based on in London. London got all these facilities built. London had all of these benefits, the velodrome being built, the Olympic Stadium being built, the housing. So there's really unfair benefits for the actual host cities that are hosting the event themselves. Local people moved out of houses. So again, if we're looking at the accommodation for the event can be used for housing as a positive, i.e. London 2012 Olympic Village, when we built the Olympic Stadium, when the velodrome was being built, this was being built on already a housing estate. So the housing estate got demolished so we could build this. Therefore, people moved out of their homes, moved out of their houses that they grew up in, that they lived in. Increased terrorism threat, okay, due to the fact that we've got just an increased global impact on us. Therefore, that is something that we can have as a negative. As well as increased traffic and pollution. We're creating these transport links. We're getting more transport links provided around the City of London. However, this then increases traffic around London and also pollution around London as well. So hopefully, again, these positives and negatives are trying to be linked together. So if you can think of one positive, you've got the negative almost for that. Okay, so if we're looking at positive and negative impacts of hosting global sports events on economics, positives, increased economy from tourism, e.g. we're getting money spent in our shops. Okay, when we have to be able to apply this, you won't get any marks, or you can't just say increased economy from tourism. Well, how does the economy increase? It's because these tourists are spending money in our shops. We are employing more people because we have an increase in tourism, so we need to get more people working. as I just said there, increased employment opportunities, therefore more income tax. What I mean by this is more people are working, therefore more people are paying tax, which means less people are on benefits, which means we're getting an increase in the economy throughout the whole nation. So again, we are getting, with these global events, it creates hundreds of jobs, not just for the actual events themselves. As I said, more people around London means more people are needed in coffee shops, for example. So you get an increased employment, and therefore, again, this has to be linked. You can't just say increased employment opportunities. This means that more people are paying income tax, which means less people are on benefits, which means our economy is doing better. And then also on economics, the shop window effect. So this could potentially increase global trading opportunities. We are getting the opportunity to essentially show off. Okay, so we show off how good our country is, how good London is. If we think back to the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, it promoted Britain in a positive light, didn't really show any negativity around Britain. So, for example, the 2011 London riots that took place, we didn't showcase that. We're not going to showcase that because it doesn't put us in a good light. Okay, we're going to show off our country, where sport originated from, and so on. So the shop window effect increases potential global trading opportunities, i.e. people look at the country, go, that's a good country, I wouldn't mind trading with that country. So they are positives for economical purposes. Negatives alongside this are bidding is extremely expensive and can lead to debt. Okay, so just so you know, when England put in a bid for the 2018 World Cup, it cost £21 million and we failed. We didn't even get the World Cup, so we spent 21 million on essentially nothing, which means our taxes increase, which is a real negative. There's also quite a famous example in the 1976 Montreal Olympics. It's kind of like something called like the 40-year hangover, because they overspent, the government overspent, and 1.6 billion in debt they ended up being in, which was obviously a really bad thing for the country of Canada, because then essentially their taxes were high for a very long time. Employment opportunities are temporary, leading to reduced economy. Okay, so once all this tourism has left London, for example, these people that had jobs are now losing their jobs. So that's a negative with regards to on economy. Finally, political, there'll be a kind of crossover from what we've just spoken about there, economical as well as political. So positives, reflects well on the government if the global event goes well. Okay, so if the event goes well, London 2012 did, it makes the people in power look really good, okay, because they have essentially been successful, because it's been such a positive games or World Cup or event. We've spoken about the shop window effect. This takes the pressure off government in other areas. I mentioned the 2011 London riots. That was really serious situation that was that London was in at that time. The government were getting absolutely hounded for this because nothing was being done. And then all of a sudden we have London 2012, which is a success. The shop window effect, all of a sudden we're showing off how brilliant we are. People almost forget about what happened, so it takes that pressure off the government in other areas. And then finally, nation building again. So it brings a sense of national pride and purpose, which we've already spoken about. This is really good politically for the politicians who are in power at that time. Negatives, reflects poorly on government if there is an overspend. So for example, I just said about the 1976 Montreal Olympics. They overspent drastically, and they do call it the 40-year hangover from that, because they're 1.6 billion in debt, and then the taxes have been high for 40 years pretty much to try and pay the debt of the Montreal Olympics. Can highlight negative events such as terrorist attacks. Government have to take responsibility for terrorist attacks, i.e. they don't have enough security in place. Therefore, politically, it's a bit of a nightmare if an event like that did happen, because they weren't having the safety of the athletes, the spectators, participants and so on in mind. And then finally, can lead to political protests over lack of spending on healthcare education. If you think back to Rio, Rio is a very poor city within Brazil. There are a lot of favelas, so a lot of shanty towns, people living in really poor conditions, not having healthcare. Then the World Cup came along, and the Olympics as well, and they spent all of this money on these fantastic facilities. And the local people are just like, where's this money coming from? How can we afford this? But yet you can't even afford to kind of put people into housing. You can't afford healthcare, but you can afford to build multi-million pound stadiums and so on. So again, whenever we've got a positive, we do tend to have a negative with regards to these global events. So if you can get good Cornell notes on those, please get questions down, and I'll see you in lesson. Thank you.